All right, I want to welcome everyone to the final seminar for the term in our Interrogating Development seminar series. For those of you who don't know me, I am Devika Datta. I'm a lecturer in development economics in the Department of International Development. And in the seminar series this term, we've basically just invited authors of new books related to issues of development. And yeah, I had a seminar around it, followed by a discussion. Today, I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Angus McNelly to discuss his new book, Now We Are in Power, The Politics of Passive Revolution in 21st Century Bolivia. Angus is a senior lecturer in international relations at the University of Greenwich. His research agenda looks at the politics of transformative change through, on the one hand, the left in power in 21st century Latin America, and on the other hand, the political economy of development in Latin America. And this book was published, this first monograph was published earlier this year by University of Pittsburgh Press. After Angus discusses his book, presents his book to us in the discussions, it'll be followed by a discussant, comments by Dr. Aiko Ikamura Amaral, who is a lecturer in international development. No, sorry, lecturer. I forget what's her exact title, international development in the department as well. Aiko's research addresses the politicization and urbanization of indigeneity in Bolivia, the personal narratives of women who work in street markets, and the everyday dimensions of broader development related to issues and transformation in urban contexts of Latin America. So Angus will have about 45 minutes, 50 minutes to present his book. Thereafter, we'll have discussant comments, and then we'll open up for discussion, question and answer. Angus, I would love for you to join us now. And I can move the slides, okay?
Thanks, Devika, and thank you for the invitation to come here and speak. It's a real pleasure to talk to you. I think this is the second time that I'm presenting in public, so I'm very, very excited. And I'm doubly excited because I get to discuss it with someone who's been present pretty much throughout the process of writing it. From kind of before I went on field work, planning the stage, helping me really think about when I was in La Paz, what I was trying to do, how I did my research ethically, what it meant to be a British researcher in Latin America. So Aiko, thank you very much for being here today. So the goal of the book, Now We Are in Power, is to examine what happened to the radical potential of a broad coalition of anti-neoliberal social movements in Bolivia during the first decades of the 21st century, okay? And I think in order to understand what I try and do in the course of the book, it's worth explaining where I come from, right? I think of myself as a child of 2008, okay? I was studying economics and maths during the 2008 crisis, and capitalism came to within kind of a couple of hours of ending, and nobody who was teaching me economics could explain what on earth was going on. Okay, so I left my undergraduate in 2010 to a politics of austerity with a mantra of kind of there is no alternative. Student protests erupted as part of the struggles against the deepening commodification of social life. And I started to think, there's got to be another way of doing this, right? What are the alternatives? Where in the world is doing something different, okay? And Bolivia during the first decade of the 20th century seemed to be somewhere that was doing something very, very different, okay? So you had between 2000 and 2005, 5 years of social movement revolt strong enough to topple two neoliberal governments and act as a cauldron hot enough to forge radical demands to transform Bolivian society. So out of these social movements emerged the country's first indigenous president, Evo Morales, a constituent assembly to refound the country along the lines of plurinationalism, the nationalization of hydrocarbons and agrarian reform as part of a new political economy, and purportedly a new way of doing government, okay? A government of social movements. Okay, so starting from the title helps illuminate the driving force behind the book, okay? And the title comes from a question of one of the participants in the Movimiento al Socialismo, the movement towards socialism party, MAS, Evo Morales party's school of political formation, which ran in the city of El Alto in the second half of 2016. Okay, so you're going to see the guy who asked this photo a little bit, not yet. You're going to see the guy who asks this question a little bit later on. I'll try and point him out. Okay, kind of a very kind of combative participant, right? And he stood up, yeah, to ask, I think a minister at the time, a minister who was in government. And so he said, Evo came to power. Now we are in power. Now the Aymara and Quechua are in power. We are more than 65% of the population, and no one is going to arrive at power through a coup d'etat, because we know that we are going to govern eternally, okay? And so for me, this was a really interesting intervention, right? It was someone who was coming from social movement tradition in a city that was known as a rebel city. I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. Who was speaking directly to government, right? There's this idea that kind of the historically oppressed had come to power and that these changes couldn't be undone, okay? And there's a sense that now we are in power, okay? Coming from marginalized communities in the city of El Alto. Right. So in terms of the main argument of the book, there are two sides, okay? And so the first side of the argument explores the passive element of Gramsci's oxymoronic concept of passive revolution, okay? It concerns the revolutionary drive of social movements that in a moment of crisis were able to transcend the mere challenge to the status quo and establish alternative future horizons. However, following the zenith of the moment of catharsis, movement leaders, along with their central demands, were incorporated into the state, thus turning movements from offensive actors pushing for social change to defenders of the left and state power. Okay, this in my theoretical framework, okay, I captured through the idea of transformism. And I'm interested in the book in tracing the trajectory of revolutionary forces after they have unseated their initial opponents from power. Okay, so in short, I trace the mechanisms and effects of social movement pacification throughout the course of what I consider to be passive revolution. The second side, thank you, Dev. The second side of my argument concerns the dynamics of restoration set in motion by passive revolution. I'm going to explain a little bit about how I understand passive revolution in a minute. I show how the new social and spatial configurations of power, the novel forms of power and the capitalist state that emerge in 20th century Latin America, established through passive revolution, are contradictory, unstable, and in continual need of renewal. By placing movement incorporation and transformism in conversation with the spatial and scalar dynamics of passive revolution, I show the tensions inherent in processes of passive revolution. And I think this is something that is overlooked when we are speaking about what happens to movement incorporation. I think it's often seen as a theological process, one that is doesn't lead to moments of political opportunity, okay? I underscore how passive revolutions are also a set of social spatial processes that unsettle social movement incorporation, and how neo-extractivism, the dominant form of value creation established by passive revolution in 21st century Latin America, not only provided the material foundations for new hegemonic state practices and forms, but also undermined the basis of this newfound hegemony, sparking new rounds of social conflicts over accumulation by dispossession and the environmental and ecological maladies that leak from the pores of extractive industries and their associated infrastructures. So in order to kind of think about the Bolivian case, okay, to grapple with what happened in the case, and I'm going to try and trace exactly what happened in the second half of the talk. I first need to turn and explain a little bit about how I understand passive revolution, okay? And for me, passive revolution, which is a concept that was developed by Gramsci in the 1920s when he was sitting in a fascist jail, is a particular response to crises of capitalism. Okay, it's a way to comprehend the response of the state to particular crises of capitalism that cannot be contained within the levy of politics. Okay, and for me, passive revolutions are comprised of moments internal to passive revolution. Okay, catharsis, transformism, and Caesarism. And passive revolutions also have dynamics. Okay, they play out in a broader concept which dialectically shapes and is shaped by mechanisms of passive revolution. Okay, and I think about this concept in terms of space and time. So in terms of the three moments of passive revolution, we had catharsis, which is the first moment, which is a moment of class struggle, a crisis of hegemony so strong that it breaks the levees of political society and has to be resolved on the plane of civil society, and a moment that produces new collective subjects or intersubjectivities. So this is a moment of radical potential. Okay, a moment where it seems like there is the potential to do something different. Okay, and it's arguably this moment of catharsis, that drew me to Bolivia in the first place. The second and third moments really are concerned with what happens after that initial moment of radical potential. So transformism captures how movement leaders are absorbed into the state, and later how ideas and demands are incorporated into state projects, allowing for the incorporation of entire movements. It is also a moment of the resignification of revolutionary program demands, which leads to a process of resubjectification. Okay, the production of new subjects in the form using the language of revolutionary subjectivity that lose their potential to drive processes of change. The third moment of passive revolution is Caesarism. Okay, normally Gramsci talks about Caesarism as a moment where you have a revolutionary force on the one hand and a reactionary force on the other, and neither is able to win out. There's this famous phrase, the old is dying and the new cannot be born. This is kind of a time of monsters, right? So you need a third exit, like an alternative way out, okay? And Caesarism for Gramsci captures that alternative way out, okay? It's embodied by a leader or a party. And for me, in Bolivia, we can see Evo Morales through his role. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how his presentation as a sublime and profane character allows him to assume the kind of third exit in this moment of crisis. Sorry. So those are the kind of moments of passive revolution. In terms of the dimensions, for me, I see passive revolution playing out over the spatial temporality of the capitalist system, and so is shaped and itself shapes spatio-temporal conditions or dimensions, okay? And I'm going to say a little bit about how I think about these processes in terms of space and then time. So for me, space is produced, differentiated, and contested within any hegemonic project, and so shaped by the uneven development of class struggle. If we think about space like this, we can think about passive revolution as an emergent spatialization strategy that structures and shapes state power, which analyzes uneven and discontinuous geographies, and is concerned with how relational dynamics between areas of backwardness and economic process and between city and country bear on processes of class struggle and state formation. So if we think about returning to the moments of passive revolution, okay, the moment of catharsis and the moment of transformism in particular, we can see that in the moment of catharsis, the logic of abstract space, okay, this mappable empty space that can be filled by value creating activities, is disrupted by social struggles, okay? And social struggles don't just occur in space, but themselves are spatial practices that include things like digging ditches and trenches, blocking highways with railway carts, setting up checkpoints, and controlling, using the space of a city in order to further social struggle. Okay, and this will become clear when I talk about a little bit about what I do in the first chapter. In terms of transformism, the incorporation of popular sectors can be, and in the Bolivian case was, organized territorial, and determined by physical location of the actors. Okay, and we can think about, say, rural indigenous movements, urban neighborhood organizations being strong social forces that were incorporated into Evo Morales' political project, defined on where they were spatially, not just what they did politically. Varying transformism across space also occurred because public policies and radical demands as they were implemented were differentiated vis-a-vis kind of like localities, right? So if we think about the major demand, one of the major demands, and we'll see this a little bit later on, of social movements was the nationalization of gas. The gas fields are very, very far away from urban centers, and it's very, very difficult to show populations that gas has been nationalized. So how do you show populations that it's been nationalized, and how do people experience that? Okay, and part and parcel of this difficulty of making social movement demands appear is a spatial problem as well. In terms of time, my discussion of abstract, concrete, and historical time in the book builds upon the theorization of time by Walter Benjamin, E.P. Thompson, Moish Stone, Andreas Malm, and others, and I offer a temporal rereading of passive revolution through the Marxist literature on time. So passive revolution for me plays out over complex webs of historical time and can be seen and marked by the complex dialectical movement of abstract time through concrete time. And this will become clear exactly what I mean when I talk about the work that I do in chapter 5. So thinking about the two moments again of catharsis and transformism, catharsis is a moment where the multiple temporalities contained in a post-colonial space like Bolivia, where you have the remnants of different social formations, of indigenous communities, all share a common time, that of politics. If we think about transformism, we can think about transformism as part and parcel of a project to re-establish abstract time. That is the time that is needed to accumulate capital. And this happens through concrete tasks. And as we shall see, part of the problem of passive revolution is the disjuncture between abstract times and the kind of desire to re-establish abstract time and the kind of breaks and ruptures that happen in concrete time when you try and build things, particularly large-scale infrastructure projects. So I don't know what you can see I've really thought about my slides.
Oh no.
Oh no.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. So in terms of the kind of theoretical contributions of the book, I think in my understanding, there are three things that I add to the literature on passive revolution. Firstly, I center processes of subjectification. This itself is nothing novel, as it is the driving force behind Massimo Modenesi's research project and some of the most interesting research that has happened in Latin America over the past 10 years, 10, 15 years on passive revolution. And Massimo's work really focuses on the kind of trialectic of autonomy, antagonism, and subalternity as a way to understand what happens to social movements under moments of passive revolution. However, Massimo's work is very theoretical, and he has not applied his schema using a case study and using such rich ethnographic detail. And I think that kind of what I add is a kind of precise reading of the mechanisms of incorporation, transformation, and the creation of new subjectivities in the Bolivian case and how they've changed over time. Secondly, so my ethnographic data allows me to interrogate kind of how passive revolution plays out on a more granular level, okay? And this is where the arguments around passive revolution being incomplete, contested, and unstable come from, okay? Many of the observations in the book may seem quite theoretical at first, but are actually drawn from 18 months worth of fieldwork and me grappling with kind of the ways in which the data that I collected kind of really challenged my preconceptions about what I thought I was going to find when studying urban social movements, okay? And what I should explain is that when I was doing most of the data for the book comes from 2 field visits, an 18-month field visit in 2016, 2017, where I worked with 4 different types of organizations in the cities of La Paz, El Alto, and Santa Cruz, which are kind of 3 of the biggest cities in Bolivia. And so I worked with neighborhood organizations, labor unions, neighborhood councils, and market guilds, the 4 most important different types of organizations, in my opinion. And what I found, particularly when looking at what happened to social movements, what happened to the actors that were pushing for radical change, really kind of made me question everything that I thought I was going to find. And in particular, kind of the accounts of social movement incorporation, even those using passive revolution, and what they missed, okay? The final contribution, theoretical contribution, before I move on to the empirics, is I situate these processes of subjectification in broader political and political economic transformations through the use of space and time. This helps to demonstrate the incongruence at the heart of the different moments of passive revolution and the diachronism between its different elements. So this is kind of a really, really important insight, as, in my opinion, is also the dialectical interplay between the economic and the political. So passive revolution is often treated as a particular response to the crisis of capitalism on the terrain of politics, okay? So when I was laying out my arguments, I talked about it in terms of the state, and I think it very much is. But what I demonstrate is the way in which passive revolution reestablishes the conditions for capital accumulation through, in the Bolivian case, the appropriation of natural resource rents, which is the dominant form of capital accumulation in Latin America during this period, and how then this feeds back onto processes of passive revolution. If passive revolution is a particular response to crises and it is trying to reestablish the conditions needed for capital accumulation, what happens when those conditions are reestablished? How does that then affect processes of social movement incorporation? So that's the kind of dense theory bit over, I promise. And what I'm going to turn to now is some of the main kind of some of the main findings of each of the chapters, and I've tried to pick out quotations from either the meetings that I went to or my interviews that help kind of illustrate some of the key points that I'm trying to drive home in each of the chapters. So the guy who gave the great quote, which gave the book its title, who's that guy there? Yeah, who, as you can see, looks like he's already kind of steeling himself to ask a brilliant question. I love this photo because it kind of captures a lot of what the School of Political Formation was about. And I went to probably 15 to 20 of these meetings twice a week between June 2016 and January 2017. Most of the attendees of these meetings were Indigenous people from the city of El Alto, which is a relatively new city that exploded under neoliberalism after neoliberal reforms in 1985, the closure of the mines, but also the El Niño La Niña event of 1982, 1983, which drove lots of people off arable land and into the city of El Alto. Okay, so it's a place which was marked by kind of migrants. You could tell where people came from by the language they used. If someone used compañero, which means comrade, they were come from a mining community, or their family was from a mining community. Hermano, hermana was more a marker of rural people who associated themselves either with peasant unions or indigenous movements, depending on which part of the Altiplano they came from. Okay, so this was a really interesting space, a really challenging space to be in as well. And as you can see, I stick out like a sore thumb when I'm there as quite clearly the only white person in the room. And I'm also quite tall, which adds to kind of the fact that everybody definitely knew I was there and definitely knew that I wasn't from El Alto. Okay, so part of the richness of actually what I got from the questions of these participants was the fact that they weren't speaking to me. Okay, often they were either speaking to one another or they were speaking to the ministers in the room. Okay, so in terms of the major kind of, before I get on to that quote there, in terms of the major empirical contributions of the book as a whole, okay, I think I can say a number of things. So firstly, initially I wanted to correct the focus of social movement scholars concerned with Bolivia and what I consider the undue focus on rural areas. In the 21st century, approximately 3/4 of the population lives in cities. The heart of the social movement struggles in the period 2000 to 2005, the two moments that were strong enough to topple governments, centered on a city, the city of El Alto. So why are social movement scholars focusing on rural social movements at the expense of urban ones? Okay, I think there are good reasons that you can focus on rural movements, but I was intrigued that no one was really taking their time to think about how urban social movements worked. Likewise, despite some notable exceptions, the city of Santa Cruz had been almost entirely absent from analysis of Evo Morales' government. Plan 3000, the Ciudadela where I lived for 5 months in 2017, was at the heart of protests in 2008, but had only been studied by one person, Marxo Chavez. And as far as I know, me and Marxo are the only people who have studied Plan 3000. Although I think Cuna Reina might be doing some research now. But the fact I can name all of the people who might be doing research on what is considered to be the kind of most rebellious, most interesting neighborhood in the biggest city in Bolivia is telling about the dearth of research that we have here. Okay. In terms of what my data revealed, that was surprising. Data analysis was like peeling layers off an onion. And many of the ethnographic insights of the chapters only came once I had let my field notes and interview transcripts sit for some years, okay? So the first thing that I discovered after kind of letting this kind of data sit, and I took my PhD and I spent 3 years completely rewriting it in order to produce this book. So the first thing that I discovered was that the story told about how social movement incorporation worked, okay, which in the dominant narratives was an incorporation along party lines, I found this to be inadequate. And it missed how social movement leaders actively negotiated their incorporation, okay? And this realization only really came 9 months into the fieldwork, and it only really came through participation in this school of political formation in the city of El Alto. I found that social movement leaders were acutely aware of their incorporation, and there was agency in managing incorporation, albeit under a broader set of adverse structural conditions. Okay, and I think it's worth turning to the quote that I have on the board that really helps illuminate some of what I'm trying to get at. Okay, so this is, I think, from the opening session of the School of Political Formation, where one of the organizers was explaining the rationale for organizing these sessions. And he says, during recent times, compañeros, we have been converted from the protagonists of the proceso de cambio into its benefactors. We are waiting to see what is going to benefit us, to see which public works Evo is going to do for us, and we are still waiting, hoping. Esperando in Spanish is either waiting or hoping. It's unclear. You can understand it both ways. But this revolution will happen only when we mobilize ourselves to transform the country. The state is performing its function, but other than that, the other fundamental wheels that need to turn are the social movements, and they have stopped participating. So I found this quite illuminating, because I was expecting to go along and find social movement leaders who were going to sing the praises of Evo Morales, sing the benefits of being incorporated into the state. They themselves were benefactors, right? They had received resources from the state in order to organize these sessions that, in the dominant narrative, would be sessions that justified the government of Evo Morales and the social movement leader roles within that government. And what I found was a disquiet, even amongst the organizers of these events, to kind of what this relationship had meant. Okay, and there was a real understanding that some of the dynamism, some of the ability to propose changes had been lost through the course of the, at that point, 10 years of Evo Morales' government in power, okay? And a real sense that the modalities of incorporation had been negative for social movements, okay? And this was really surprising for me, because it really challenged kind of the dominant perceptions that that have come out of lots of studies on social movement incorporation in Bolivia. So I talk about that in more detail in chapter 2, okay? The second thing that I found really, really surprising, that only really emerged kind of after years and years and years of having my data, was the sense of being forgotten, okay? Which, along with the importance of public works, only came out long after I had done my fieldwork. Looking back over my field notes and the recordings I had of participant questions at the School of Political Formation, I realized that people in both El Alto and Santa Cruz talked about being forgotten, okay? And the quote I have on the board is from, I think it's actually from the School of Political Formation, okay? So it says, the leaders who have been criticized for supporting the party in Evo, how have they been paid back? It seems that as if Evo has abandoned society. Those that supported the mass have been forgotten. It is not the same struggle as before, when the government fought for the poor. There are no new generation of leaders, and if there were, they would fall into what is now the proceso de cambio and would be shut down. The mass does not encourage new leaders to emerge. Only they can be leaders. The people have started to realize this, and because of this, in the next elections in 2019, the mass are not going to win. Okay, there's some sort of precedence there, and we have to remember that this is in one of the cities that had been a bastion of support for the mass previously. There is no point in continuing to support them. We thought that they were going to be the government of the poor, but now that does not seem so. Or they have a pro-poor discourse. In practice, this is not the case. Okay, the remarkable thing about this quote is from a mass organized event. And this is a El Alto activist speaking to a government minister. Okay, so there is a real sense of a kind of like very kind of explicit criticism of the government in 2016 and what it was trying to do. But also, I found it really, really interesting in the way that it was framed. Okay, the fact that the people of El Alto had been forgotten. Do you want to do the next? And we see the same thing in Santa Cruz, okay? And so the place I did my research in Santa Cruz, Plan 3000, was seen as the most dangerous neighborhood of the most dangerous city in Bolivia, okay? It was a commercial space that was filled with migrants, mostly from the interior of the country, most of whom would have self-identified as indigenous. And there was a real sense that they were also fighting against being forgotten. Okay, so this is the leader of the 19 associations of La Rotonda, the roundabout, which you can see in the background there. And he says, the leaders who have been criticized for supporting the party in Evo, and that's the same quote. Have we got? No, it's the same one. Oh, no. Damn it. So I've obviously completely messed up. Okay, so he had another quote about, do you want to go back to that? So he had another quote about basically how the market vendors of this market, and you can see that there was a fire there in 2017, they'd gone all the way to La Paz. Okay, this is a 24-hour coach journey. They got on the coach, and they got on the coach because they wanted to see the president. Yeah, they wanted to go and see the president because obviously that's a normal thing to do, right? And they couldn't get in, and they were basically fobbed off, and they were told, no, you can't see the president. And their discourse was very much Santa Cruz is being forgotten. Okay, these are people who have fought to support the mass. Okay, in 2008 there were battles between kind of resurgent right-wing forces and indigenous peoples and the people of the neighborhoods in this very barrio here, okay? And so there was a sense that these people had paid their dues and they were also being forgotten. So it wasn't just in El Alto in these meetings that you heard this discourse. I also heard it from leaders of the market guilds who were seen as some of the most radical social organization leaders in the city of Santa Cruz. You had the same sense that they were also being forgotten by the government. And we can see the importance of being forgotten in this photo. This photo is arguably the result of 14 years of being forgotten, okay? And in one of the chapters of my PhD, which actually kind of fell out of the book, I talk about the process of trying to move this informal marketplace from the roundabout, from La Rotonda to a new purpose-built market. Okay, and we can see part of the reason why they want to move it is because it was dirty, dangerous, and quite clearly a fire hazard. So this fire in August 2017, luckily none of my friends and interlocutors were affected. Okay, but it was seen as the catalyst for actually them finally moving out of La Rotonda into the new marketplace, which I subsequently have had the pleasure of visiting. So for me, this discourse of being forgotten had interesting spatial and temporal elements. Spatially, there was a tacit analysis of uneven development. Somewhere else was benefiting at the expense of El Alto and Santa Cruz. And both of the people often talk about Cochabamba being the kind of like third city that benefits because, I don't know, Cochabamba is arguably the most forgotten out of all of these cities, but it was anywhere else other than El Alto or Santa Cruz that was benefiting. For me, this pointed to the difficulties of realizing the promises of radical demands, even when they have been ostensibly met. This is why in chapter 3, I focus on the spatial dynamics of passive revolution and the difficulties of manifesting social demands in space. Temporally, it implies a sense of being left behind. Progress must be happening because of the promise of modernity contained within hydrocarbons. So why hasn't the quotidian life of urban space in La Paz, El Alto, or Santa Cruz been instantly transformed? Where is the advancement? There is kind of arguably a disjuncture between the theology of hydrocarbons and modernity, the manifestation of abstract time of capitalism, and the concrete time of infrastructure projects and development modules more generally, marked by delays, abandonment, frustration. It is this temporal dissidence that sits front and center in chapter 5. Next slide. Okay. Yeah. So if we think about the role of Evo Morales here, Evo Morales is often lumped together with other Latin American leaders of the time as being a populist. Okay. And for me, the discourses around populism were inadequate, right? It didn't really distinguish between political programs, left or right were populist. Anything that was not neoliberal seemed to be populist. And it didn't really get to grips with the social forces and the configuration of the social forces under particular political projects. But undoubtedly, there are kind of aspects of kind of Evo Morales' leadership that are really, really important. Okay, and this comes from a photo taken of a friend of mine, Andrea Marsden, yeah, which is Evo Morales and Tupac Katari. Right, Tupac Katari was the indigenous leader who led the Great Revolt of 1781, which laid siege to the city of La Paz, killing half of the residents, and he was seen to be the kind of one of the main leaders of indigenous resistance to colonialism in the period of Spanish colonization. So one of the famous quotes of Tupac Katari is when he was captured, apparently he said, "I will return and I will be millions." Okay, this is quite clearly presenting Evo Morales as the reincarnation of Tupac Katari, right? And one of the first people I interviewed when I got to La Paz, Trotskyist teacher, complained about the pull of Evo Morales. And he said, the mass has made the people believe that Evo Morales is a type of saint or apostle. Okay. And I think that he got it the wrong way around, because Evo Morales is not a follower, he was a leader, right? And one of the things that I became interested in is, well, what is it about Evo Morales that makes him so seductive, right, as a leader? What makes people be drawn to him? I think there's another. And this came up time and time again in my interviews. The people kind of thanking Evo Morales personally, like the people that I talked about before, traveling halfway across the country to go and have a meeting with the president, with one person, not a ministry that could help them, not a functionary that was in charge of actualizing policy. No, they wanted to see Evo Morales. Like, why? Right? And so one of the people who was involved in the School of Political Formation in El Alto said, when I interviewed him, I'm very thankful to our president because Bolivia has changed and now we are not poor. We are not poor thanks to our president, Evo Morales. Okay, it seems like as a person, he was responsible for everything and anything, right? And one of the questions that I was really interested is why? Okay, what is it about Evo Morales that makes him so special? And the way I got at this problem was through what I saw as the two sides of Evo Morales. Okay, the sublime, the sense that he is the reincarnation of Tupac Katari. Okay, a president that can do no wrong. And much of this kind of untouchableness came from the fallibility of the people he had around him. Okay, the so-called invitados, the people who were invited to form a government with him, and the kind of personification of this figure I can see in the vice president of Alvaro Garcia Linero, who was a Marxist intellectual, white, Cochabambino, who was seen as the kind of antithesis of Evo. Okay, so whenever there were policy mistakes, whenever the state enacted violence against different political movements, it was seen as, well, Evo doesn't really know because his ministers aren't explaining what's going on. Okay, and it was the fallibility of his ministers that showed the sublime character of Evo Morales. At the same time, he was profane, right? The country's first indigenous president, okay, he had 2 inaugurations, one at the presidential palace, the other at Tiwanaku, which is one of the sacred sites which was at the heart of one of the pre-Columbian societies. Okay, and he really lent into the fact that he came from a family of llama herders, and he did things like play football. There was an infamous video of him violently assaulting someone on a football field. And one of the things, if I was going to talk about shortfalls that I'm sure Eiko was going to mention, I don't talk about gender a lot, but he was seen as very much kind of like a macho man that kind of made mistakes and did stuff that kind of Bolivia men do, and that's fine, right? So that kind of made him also very relatable, one of the people. Okay. And I think that this kind of dual character of Evo Morales was really, really important in helping advance the particular kind of physiognomy that passive revolution assumed in Bolivia. Okay. So the third thing that came as a real surprise when I was looking at my data was kind of a temporal disjuncture. Okay. And what happened was that without really realizing it, I went back through all of my interviews, and loads of the local activists in both El Alto and Santa Cruz were talking about obras públicas, public works or infrastructure. And I became really interested in, well, why is infrastructure so important? Okay. And what I started to think was, well, if we look at these two quotes here, they're from the city of El Alto. Yeah. And there's a real sense that the mayor of El Alto, Soledad Chapiton, was failing because there were no public works. Okay. There was a sense that Bolivia had gained natural resource when it nationalized hydrocarbons. Okay. The economy was doing well. Okay. The mayor was doing badly because there were no public works. Yeah. And some of the mass functionaries complained that they'd built basically kind of like a water system and sewage works. But because all the pipes are beneath the ground, they had no way of showing the local population that they'd done any of this work, right? Which was a problem. So thinking about the aesthetics of infrastructure, or the poetics of infrastructure, as they talk about in the book, infrastructure as a spectacle, as well as a modality to transform quotidian life, was really, really important, right? And it helps explain how social movement demands are difficult to implement, even when they're incorporated into state projects. Do you want to go to the next slide? Okay. And so, yeah, okay. So the mayor of Santa Cruz at the time I was doing fieldwork was a guy called Percy Fernandez, who was an engineer, and everybody loved him because he designed a series of schools that were built across the city. He was seen as a man that could deliver infrastructure. Okay. And I spoke to the head of the neighborhood federation in Santa Cruz, and he said, Percy Fernandez is very good because he has delivered public works. He has dedicated himself to his work, and it's always good to have a mayor who is an engineer. He has put all his work, soul, heart, life. Whom he does or does not work with is down to his intelligence rather than any political agenda. And this is really interesting because Percy Fernandez is a very controversial figure at the best of times, as the next two quotations show. So in another interview with someone from the neighborhood federations, he says, look, you can say that Percy Fernandez has planned the city. Beyond the complaints about acts of corruption, his management is approved by us. Yeah. So sometimes in Latin America, there's an idea that corruption is central. Corruption is stopping stuff from happening, right? In the case of Percy Fernandez, they know that there's corruption and they don't really care because stuff is still getting built. Yeah. And the sense of being able to manifest the gains of social movements, the gains of hydrocarbons in space, yeah, through public works is really, really important. And it skates over the horrific racism of Bessie Fernandez as well. So in the crisis of 2008, he is talking about the mass government. He says what the executive branch of government wants to do with the reforms where they're trying to reform the tax system and the way that hydrocarbon rents are managed is to keep all the power for itself, con todo la indiana, with all this Indian scum, which is an incredibly offensive thing to say, okay? That was 8 years before the other two quotes, okay, which shows the power of being able to build infrastructure. So I'm aware that I've been speaking for kind of 45 minutes now. And so I think we need to get on to where the book ends, which is probably kind of what all of you here in the room know about Bolivia, is there was a massive crisis in October, November 2019. There were a series, kind of a month of social unrest, accusations of fraud in elections, a coup d'etat. And in this period, you see a massive fracture of Bolivian society and a polarization which was very, very intense, which kind of split friendship groups, split kind of the whole academic community of people inside and outside Bolivia as they tried to make sense of what was going down. And so what I try and do in the final chapter of the book is take the elements of passive revolution that I identify in the previous 5 chapters and use them as a framework through which we can understand what happened, okay? So I split this final chapter into 3 parts. The first looking at social spatial breakdowns, resurgent regionalism, and the lithium coup. The second looking at Caesarism's limits and the unintended consequences of a sublime profane president. And finally, transformism and incomplete pacification. And what I try and do through looking at this crisis through these 3 lenses is show how the uneven and incomplete and contradictory character of passive revolution provides the conditions under which the crisis of October, November 2019 explodes. Okay, so I'm not claiming that we can explain all of the crisis through the lens of passive revolution. What I am saying is that the conditions under which a crisis like this has fuel to explode in the way that it does, we can see the conditions, we can see some of this fuel in the contradictory form that passive revolution takes as it unfurls over 15 years. Okay, the chapter shows the spatial and social divisions of the previous period and how they were papered over by passive revolution, which offered the appearance of radical transformation without substance, which meant that in the context of deteriorating economic conditions following the end of the commodities boom between 2002 and 2013, and the eventual arrival of the 2008 crisis in Bolivia, okay, there was ample fuel for a social and political crisis that would violently shake the new social spatial order formed under passive revolution. And so what I've tried to do over the past 50 minutes is give you a sense of where I'm trying to go with the book and some of the things that have surprised me in the course of writing it. I think often in a place like Bolivia, people kind of drop in and have their own preconceived notions about which theories they're going to use and kind of try and shoehorn stuff into the case. Okay, and that's something that I tried to strongly resist, despite the fact that I'm reading the country through a lens developed by an Italian Marxist, right? But I think it's really, really important to underscore how the way I understand passive revolution and the way I try and tease out the kind of incongruencies of it come from the data itself, which lead to this this kind of rich reading of passive revolution as a historical framework through which we can understand moments of crisis that produce the seeds of potential to do something different. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angus.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to comment on this book, and thank you, Angus, for inviting me to read and also forcing me to read, because I've been telling Angus I was going to read it for some time. So I finally got the opportunity to read, and it is such a great book, Angus. It's truly very, it's very strong, very powerful, and it's very impressive. I mean, you're just finishing your presentation saying that you use Gramsci to read the situation in Bolivia. And I feel that as you read the introduction and how you explain how you're going to apply the notion of passive revolution to explain the context in Bolivia, I asked myself, can you read it in any other way? You know, it's just like, if you know Bolivia and if you have been working on Bolivia, as I was before I read this book, you can foresee the elements and the points that are going to raise, because you make it so clear. And I'll be honest, much clearer than many of the other people that you cite here that also have used Gramsci in the Latin American context. And I'm thinking more about the Brazilian ones that I was forced to read and I couldn't understand very much. But in general, for a work that is very fragmentary and has been read, translated, criticized, discussed in so many different ways, I think you do an amazing work of introducing this theory and applying it later on to your analysis. So I think this is absolutely fantastic. This is laudable. This is not the only part of your work that is incredible and inviolable. Inviolable, I don't know if that's the word, the way you say it, but you've read so much. And the most annoying part of it is that I know you did read all the references you have here, which is absurd, but it is really, you make very good use of the rest of the literature you use as well, the vast amounts of it, including literature that comes from Latin America. You did, I know the first thing, so Angus and I did field work at the same time. And on the first day I met him, I was just like drinking liters of water and trying to survive the altitude. And Angus had already gone to like 3 bookshops and bought like 10 books. And so I know that you did a very good research to be able to incorporate not only your experience of Bolivia as you lived there and you observed and you talked to people, but also what local analysts have been saying about the context. And I think that's really important and recommended to everyone studying a country that's not their own, already grew up, and their own country as well, to be honest. I know you mentioned a lot of your ethnographic insights, and I would say that your book, ethnographic, I don't find it ethnographic. I think what you do, and you do really well, is to weave in all these observations. And this is not to the detriment of your book or the quality of it or the way that you use the data from the people. I think I do it very well. You're able to weave in these analyses into the work. And okay, I'm just giving a lot of good comments about what I find the book does well. So I think that in this sense, it's a book that can be used. It's very Bolivian focused, but it can be used to understand and how to apply if you're interested in Gramsci, if you're interested in Latin America, if you're interested in the politics of social movements, and if you're interested in knowing how you do field work really well. I think this is a very good example of all these things. You start your book by asking what are the prospects of pursuing transformative political agenda of change in the periphery of capitalism, and are places like Bolivia doomed to play out a preordained destiny, or can alternative futures be built here? And as you mentioned, for many of us that started being interested or knowing about Bolivia after the early 2000s, you know that this was a place where new horizons, new possibilities were being put in place. So we had a great cycle of revolt coming from the rural areas, the urban areas, from different sectors in society, indigenous, non-indigenous, middle classes were involved as well in different contexts, and they were fighting for different things. And this is one thing that started with that I think sometimes it disappears a little bit in your analysis. You're focusing very much on the importance of El Alto and in leading part of the struggle, in starting with the gas war that he discusses very well in this book, which was a conflict against the exports of gas through Chile, through North America. And it started with that, but it became much broader conflict than this initial thing. And your focus on the El Alto and the class base of this particular movement. Sometimes I think, and I'm not going to be talking so much about gender, I'm actually going to be talking about the other thing that I also enjoy talking about, which is indigeneity as well. There is race, and race is a very important element in your analysis, and it's particularly used instrumentally by Evo Morales, I think, in some ways, and I think you're correct to point this out. It also emerges when we're talking about racism and how race structures forms of exclusion within Bolivia, and how, particularly in Santa Cruz, how racist everything is about that place. Not everything, but how power is very racist in Santa Cruz, and how they exert power through racism as well. But at points, I feel like indigeneity, and might be my reading as well, possibly, played a very important role in galvanizing these different horizons of struggle at some point. Importantly, I would say, not only played a very important role in organizing these different struggles, but it was capital in one of the two radical demands that you're discussing here, which is the Constituent Assembly. So Bolivia called a Constituent Assembly right after Evo Morales was elected, and this led to a constitutional text that happened in 2009. This has been discussed a lot, I know, and maybe this is one of the reasons why this is not so present here. But part of what Bolivia was proposing that was so new had to do with this transformation, radical transformation of the state, in which indigeneity, and including something that you do discuss here, different forms of understanding democracy and the role of the state, many of them are not very liberal, which also led to some problems, I would say, into this coming into force at some point. Are not here. Maybe I would like to see it more. I don't know if the whole argument of the book would need a lot more of it, but trying to understand to which extent were these demands of the Constituent Assembly radical? Where did the radicalness of it lie, right? Is it, the text was old, had been reformed a couple of times to become much more neoliberal since the 1990s. And then in this context, they were asking for a much drastic transformation of the state, which it did not happen. As you say here very well in the text, it was watered down in so many ways, in so many negotiations. The other point that has to do with these radical demands, and it goes with, I think, the discussion that is at the heart of this book, and is at the heart of anyone thinking about what happens to social movements when they win, right? So if a social movement that wants to take power, wins power, gets into power, what happens? Do they become state? Do they transform state? Or are they incorporated? Which I think is the argument, where the argument is going here, right? The process of pacification. They become incorporated, co-opted, right? And then they lose this radical potential that they were showing to actually just become part of the machinery of the state. But what is the state that what is the horizon of the state that they wanted to change for, right? Is it perhaps, and this is more of a cynical question, is it perhaps that what they wanted is to be part of this state? I think that it might not be, and I think there were disputes within these movements as well, but partially, and I think that this is the next point that I would like to highlight, is that in some cases, the horizon was becoming part of the state. And as you say, there are some tensions in the lack of technical expertise to run a particular form of the state, and the lack of political capital, because Mas is not the same as the other parties that preceded him, right? So it's a very different type of organization, different type of beast, even though it becomes more institutionalized as it happens. It didn't have the same apparatus, right, as other more traditional parties have, and when you go, before in Bolivia. I know my comments are very Bolivian focused, but I think that my biggest question for you has to do with the very nature of this process of pacification. Oh, sorry, there are other compliments, but I think I'll just make it shorter. But remember this now. I have like, oh, remember this because this part is really good. But I could tell you later when we're having wine. So you're using Gramsci here, and I think you did very well. But one of the things that I miss in this political economic analysis is sometimes I feel the material gains were very much concentrated in a few, or the discussion becomes very politically centered about the process of incorporation or pacification of these demands. And there is a sense something that I tried to find in this book was what are the material gains that were also important to create this element of consensus that supports the hegemony, right? So you have coercion happening. In some cases, I think that for the largest part, the Evo Morales' government tried to deal with consensus. You mentioned very briefly at some point here, or at different points, that there are ruptures in the social movements. People were arrested, persecuted, and stuff like that. There is coercion as well. But there is a material underpinning for the consensus here, right? I had just some notes. For example, Gini index dropped 0.15. This is unprecedented. Poverty rates also dropped from, I used a very high rate, $365. That's the one I could find in our World in Data today. But it was from 35% in 2000 to 5.7% in 2019. There are changes in access to health, even though it's private in Bolivia, electricity and water, which are very important gains that were demands at the heart of it. So I think that when you're discussing the temporalities of modernity, what is the type or the concreteness of modernity as well through infrastructures, these are also very concrete gains that people felt within their lifetimes. The sense of being forgotten, which I think is present in Bolivia and in other places in different formats, also has to do with, I believe, maybe with the context in which you're doing this research, which was a moment of drop. And, you know, there was the referendum and everything. But I think something that I was missing precisely was this. So in short, it's a very good book. It's very exciting. Congratulations on it. And that's it. Sorry, I talked too much. Yeah.
No, thanks so much. Okay, so before I give you a chance to respond, I'm going to collect some questions in the short time. So yeah, who has questions for Angus? Yeah, go ahead. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, Samuel, and I'm a PhD student from International Development. So thank you again for the presentation. Of interesting. I have a question more around like the current events in Bolivia. If I'm not mistaken, recently Evo Morales and Luis Arce, they've kind of fallen out. And I wanted to know a bit more around the background of why that's the case, and also what that means moving forward, and how the social movements interpreted this falling out. Do they take it sides, or is there any variety in how they interpret it, support, you know, either fashion? So yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Also, thank you for your presentation. I'm Jin Zhang, and a PhD student from the Department of Indigenous. My question is about the concept of passive revolution. I think it's really important, and you mentioned that it's a response to the capitalist crisis. And I think in Bolivia, the situation is a response to neoliberalism. But neoliberalism itself is also a response to political crisis. So how do we differentiate these successive periods? And you have also mentioned the passive revolution is also a process. So is there an end to it, and how do we differentiate it from the normal capitalist political process? And also, may I also add, if you would like to comment on the recent development in Argentina? Yeah, because it's also a response to a crisis, but yeah.
So that's a lot of questions. So we'll do another round. Because I'm chairing, I get to add one to this slide. So yeah, thanks. I think that was so great, and I thought your comments were really good, because that's also along the lines of what I was thinking as I was hearing you talk. And I'm wondering, and maybe this is like extremely naive, even theoretically and in terms of the context of Latin America. But I wonder how much of the like the feeling of being forgotten, the feeling of being left behind by Evo Morales' government is because of like the material gains that have already been made, in a sense that, I guess in a very old school Marxist sense, like the class consciousness has been raised and now we can demand more. When previously, again, like as we pointed out, like the inequality was much higher, poverty was much higher, and infrastructure was much worse. Clearly, like these are material gains that have been made, and to what extent can we think of it in those terms, if at all? So yeah, I'll give you a chance to respond, and then we'll take another round of questions. Okay.
Thanks everybody, and thanks in particular, Aiko, for the very generous reading of the book. So I think I'm going to start with Devika's question because Aiko raised it as well. And arguably, there's another book that can be written here. Because one of the things that I changed between the PhD and writing this book, I basically took all of the class analysis out. Yeah, not because I don't think it's important, just because I think that you can tell a story, a convincing story about what happened in Bolivia through the frame of passive revolution, right? That's not to say that you can't tell another important story through what happened to the composition of classes through these processes, right? And Aiko's like exactly right. You see processes of massive kind of falls in inequality, massive falls in poverty, inclusions into kind of the economy and the financial sector in ways that are unimaginable, right? Whether you like it or not, like if you look at, say, bank accounts, right? The number of bank accounts in Bolivia has increased tenfold over the past 15 years, and you've seen a shift from 95% of debt being in dollars in the 1990s to 95% being in the domestic currency today. So a huge transformation of societies, and some of you saw one of my other PowerPoint slides where there's these amazing buildings called cholets, right? And one of the things that happens during this process is kind of the emergence of new elites. Unfortunately, it's not on that PowerPoint. New elites, particularly linked to commerce, that are indigenous, right? They are Aymara. They're seen as a new Aymara bourgeoisie, right? And so one of the really, really important things that when we're thinking about the 2019 crisis, and I do talk about this a little bit, but you're right, I could make it much more central in the book, is the fact that people's consciousness is more middle class, right? People are annoyed that like their children have gone to university and there are no jobs for them. And that like is a kind of, it sounds a little bit basic, but people were really angry about that, right? And there was a sense of like the new middle class is not having the opportunities that that they were promised through these processes, and the old elites feeling like there was increased competition for access to roles within the state and everything, and so neither side was happy, and this fed into discontent with Evo Morales from arguably 2016 onwards, the time that I was there, right? And Aiko is in a sense correct in that I was there during very much a time when crisis was starting to manifest in Bolivia, and arguably kind of it's in a even worse crisis today, but I'll get to that in a minute. And so I think this question of what the gains were is really, really important, right? But I do think that you could write a whole other book on processes of class formation that would complement what it wouldn't contradict it. It's just a complementary story to the one that I tried to tell here. In terms of demands being radical, right? And I think if I was going to be critical of myself, I think there's a slippage between revolutionary and radical at times in the book. And I think that what I mean is radical, like radical. And there's a quote that I use from Marx about radicalism being kind of grasping something by the root, right? Getting to the root of something and looking to transform it. And I think that in terms of the use of indigeneity and the demands of indigenous movements to transform the state into less liberal forms were definitely radical, right? And they were also kind of very kind of regressive in other ways, but they were radical in what they were trying to do is completely transform the kind of very form of the state and the functions that the state was expected to do. And I think that that's important. And I think that one of the things that I tried to do in chapter 2, when I talk about the Constituent Assembly and when I talk about the nationalization of hydrocarbons, I'm interested in what movements were demanding and how those demands were implemented and the particular ways that radical demands were incorporated through very technocratic means that stripped them of the potential to transform the state. And one of the things that I think is important is I think there was an opportunity in 2002, 2006, 2007 to transform the state, okay? Because of the World Bank heavily indebted countries program and ALBA, which was the Venezuela kind of regional project, by 2007, Bolivia had no debt with the IMF. Like, this is incredibly important in terms of fiscal space and the space to do economic policy that's very different. And you have the United States is overstretched in Afghanistan, right? So you have a period, you have a moment in history where the big imperial power, which has been the scourge of left-wing movements in the region, if you look at the 20th century, it's one marked by US imperialism and coup d'etats backed by the US, where actually the US is more interested in things elsewhere in the world. And the major enforcer of neoliberalism is also kind of off your back because you've paid back all of your debt, right? And I think that there was an opportunity to do something different. There were, again, domestic forces that were acting as massive brakes to that, which I also discussed in chapter 3. But I think there was the potential to do something different. And one of the things I try and do is look at the ways in which the mass governed in order to try and understand how that potential was lost, okay? Because I think that one of the things that didn't happen was precisely a transformation of the state and a transformation of the class system, even as you had the emergence of new class stratas. There wasn't a fundamental transformation in kind of the productive apparatus or the class structure around it. Okay. In terms of what happens when social movements get into power and the horizons becoming part of the state, I definitely think there's a bit of that. What I also think is that this sat alongside more radical elements that did want to transform the state. And I think both were present, and as Aiko said, the middle classes were incredibly important in particular moments. Particularly the moments where governments fell. It was the participation of the middle classes as forces who were then, the government needs to leave, that were kind of arguably decisive. That's not to say that there weren't actors within social movements who were arguably kind of driving forces behind these movements that were pushing for something much more radical. Okay, and it's one of these things where we can probably debate this till the cows come home. And someone like Federico Rossi, who's done a lot of work on Argentina, would say, no, this is all about incorporation. I think it's important to look at the more radical horizons that were orientating social movements in this moment. And that we can see in things like the demand for the Constituent Assembly and attempts by the Unity Pact to really kind of try and build a constitution and a state along very kind of different lines. Which leads me to the question on current events. So we have which is Sam's question. We have a division at the moment between Evo Morales and Lucho Arce. And one of the ways that we can understand this division is the genesis of the MAS as a political party itself. The MAS comes from debates in the 1980s and 1990s within the peasant movement, the peasant confederation, the Susutsebe, that was trying to work out, do we build a state within a state like the Zapatistas, or do we capture the levers of state power? And they decided to capture the levers of state power. They built this political instrument known as the MAS. And the part of the Susutsebe which was arguing for capturing state power were the cocaleros. The cocaleros were in a fight, a very violent fight against US-backed eradication of coca, which is the main ingredient of cocaine, which again, I'm going to talk about in a minute. And this violent struggle with basically the DEA radicalized the cocaleros and made them the most important force within the peasant movement in the 1990s and the 2000s, although there was another really important faction in the Altiplano linked to El Maico, Felipe Quispe, an indigenous Aymara leader from the rural areas there, right? And so Evo Morales he was a cocalero. He came from the coca growers movement. And so the coca growers see the MAS as their political party, right? Lucho Arce is a technocrat. He won a Chevening scholarship and did a master's in economics at the University of Warwick. He's undoubtedly a very smart guy, but he doesn't have the same social movement background. He doesn't have the same level of charisma. And so what you see at the moment is a kind of battle between the cocaleros to reclaim the MAS. And they see the party as their own. And so Arce is seen as kind of the more responsible one. He has the backing of movements in El Alto, interculturales, who are a group who are basically indigenous agricultural peasant kind of petty commodity producers that went to the lowland regions. And the Unity Pact, who are the group of social movements who came up with the proposal for the Constituent Assembly, have also come out to support Arce. So you're right, there is a massive split within the MAS. The other thing that has happened, that I was back in the summer, and apparently one of the big divides is because there are two cartels in Bolivia, and it's kind of the big elephant in the room when we talk about Latin America. Is everybody knows the cartels are there. Everybody kind of, what happened with Ecuador over the past year and a half has shown us that even in a country where we thought the cartels weren't there, they were kind of imbricated at kind of lots of levels of the state. And apparently there's also a little battle going on between cartels for control over different levels of the state apparatus. The trouble is that I don't really know to what extent how that is playing out, right? I know that kind of 5 or 6 different sources who work on different things were saying the same thing. So I think that it's true, but I don't necessarily know how that is affecting things, right? And I think that one of the challenges that we have when we look at the political economy of Bolivia is, my sense is that there is a connection between illegal gold mining, which has exploded over the past 5 years, agribusiness linked to soya, and financial services linked to the agribusiness sector and the cocaine trade. But I don't know exactly how that is playing out. I have a friend who is trying to study that, but there are obvious difficulties when trying to study that, which became most apparent when one of the Bolivian banks failed, and 2 of the executives were found, 2 of them in the space of 6 weeks fell off buildings in the city of Santa Cruz. So there are kind of difficulties when you kind of get to these questions. Finally, Jing, the question of passive evolution and kind of when it ends, and are we just discussing kind of the dynamics of capitalism? This is exactly what someone else at King's, Alex Kalinikos, has said about passive evolution, right? And the dangers of, like, does it just describe the dynamics of capitalism? And this is why I was very keen to stress that passive revolution for me is a particular response to crises of capitalism. Not all crises of capitalism elicit passive revolutions. So I don't think neoliberalism can be read as passive revolutions, because it doesn't play out on civil society in the same way, and it doesn't lead into processes of state formation in the same way. Okay. Yes, it does in different ways, but you can't say that neoliberalism is a process to kind of like restore the hegemony of the capitalist state. Like, where? Like, it's more kind of a global process as the reorganization of kind of like the valorization of value on a global scale. And I think this is something quite different, right? And I think that this is important to note about passive revolution. It's a particular crisis of capitalism that leads to a crisis of hegemony of the capitalist state, that then means that this crisis plays out over the terrain of civil society. Yeah, and it's not so much that kind of like, I think there is an end to passive evolution. I think what you could almost argue that what I'm interested in is, now we are looking at not so much passive revolution, but the kind of like ongoing kind of processes that were started initially by processes of passive revolution that probably finished with the crisis in 2019, 2020. But these processes themselves are still playing out, if that makes sense. But it's difficult. I always find it difficult to note kind of when this ends or not. But I think that it's important to note that it isn't just another way of describing kind of the processes of capitalist development.
Great, thank you so much. We're out of time. So any question will now have to wait for the one. Because I have to do like a quick spiel about, so first of all, thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Angus, for coming and presenting your book.
Just quickly, if you can buy the book, but unfortunately there's only a hard copy out at the moment. So if you want a copy on PDF, just email me and I can send you a copy.
So we are out of time and I just want to stay for the wine, please. Okay, so very quickly, as I mentioned, this was the last seminar for this term in our seminar series. Just to recap what we did this term. First, we discussed the consulting industry with Rosie Collington, based on her new book with Mariana Mazzucato, The Big Con. I think I messed up the recording for that one, so we may not have that recorded. But if it is, it will be available on our YouTube channel. Then we were supposed to have Morales from Shady Fard and Sorcha Thompson discuss their new book, She Who Struggled, which unfortunately did not take place. I'm hoping to reschedule that for the spring term, so stay tuned for that. Then a couple of weeks ago, we had Hamza Hamushin discussing his new book, Dismantling Green Colonialism, and now we had Angus discussing his book on the politics of passive revolution in Bolivia. So I would say in some we've sort of traversed many geographies, many kind of concepts, many topics, and also many different processes of development or processes that are relevant to development. So once again, stay tuned for more of these in the spring, hopefully. And yeah, if you have any suggestions about what we should do, you should just tell me. And I think now it's my talking. I'll thank Angus again, thank Aiko again, and we can proceed to have some wine. Thanks, Angus. Yeah, no, that was excellent. Let me just stop this. Oh, thank you. It was good.